thank you to everybody for joining today, and welcome to our Lunch and Learn, which is organised by North Cumbria Integrated Care Trust and Boost, the North East and North Cumbria Learning and Improvement Community for Health and Social Care. My name is Richard Lorry and I'm Head of the Knowledge and Library Services at NCIC, but it's my pleasure to welcome today Lorna Watson, who is a speech and language therapist who has worked with both adults and young children and who is delivering today's session on using affirmative professional language in our practice. The idea of these lunch and learns is that they're a relaxed, informal space for health and care staff to come together to share experiences, learn something new relating to healthcare, focus on quality improvement, be signposted for further resources, and of course, all of this whilst you listen and relax and have your lunch. Just some protocols for the session. If you keep your webcams off unless invited, and also mute when you're not speaking, that would be great for that. And just to be aware that we are recording this session, so we do make these sessions available for people afterwards. So if you would like to share the session for people who can't be here, the recording will come available. We're going to be monitoring the chat during the session, so if there's anything you want to kind of contribute as we're going along, or you want to pop questions in there for the end, that's absolutely fine. We also have a survey in there about these sessions, which also enables you to suggest other speakers and other topics if you'd like as well. So that will also be in the chat from the start, but we'll pop that in at the end as well for you. So we will have questions at the end, which you can unmute and ask, but as I say, do feel free to use the chat if you'd like to ask in that way, and if that's easier for you. So yes, I think that's all the rules and regulations for today. So Lorna, over to you, and thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining. I'm glad that Richard said it would be an informal and relaxed chat, because that is very much my approach. And I have to say as well, as a speech and language therapist, I do like to talk. So please, Richard, jump in if I'm whittering on and go past our time. So yeah, today I'm here to have a bit of a chat with you guys around affirming professional language and what that means to me and my experience. So as I've mentioned, I'm currently a speech and language therapist and I work with children and families. I currently work in the west of Cumbria and I am the autism lead for North Cumbria in speech therapy. So as I've mentioned, speech therapist by background, and I started working my career on the stroke unit and in the community adult team in the West. And I've worked in a range of roles and settings for the trust that I currently work for. My current job is working with neurodivergent children and young people, and also their families and those who support them. And I contribute to autism assessment pathways for children and young adults. And then in addition to that, I also am a safeguarding supervisor within the care group. So some terminology that I thought would be helpful just to touch on briefly as part of today's session. So I'm going to probably mention the term neurodivergence. And when I do, I'm talking about the term for when someone's brain processes, learns, or might behave differently to what is considered as typical. And neurodivergence can be innate, so things you'll have heard of such as dyslexia, ADHD, autism, or it can also be acquired. So for example, after a trauma, a brain injury, that sort of thing. You'll hear me use the word ableism, and when I do so, I'm describing discrimination that might favour people who don't have disabilities. And it can be seen in policies, it can be seen in procedures, it can be seen in the way that we have the setup of the environment. And because of this, it means that we can end up accidentally shaping or advertising that there is a certain neurotype or a certain type of ability that is better than any other. And then affirming professional language. So this is language that is descriptive and it doesn't judge, it doesn't enforce opinion, and it doesn't influence or predict outcomes. So how did I end up doing a deep dive into affirming professional language? Well, about 3 to 4 years ago, I joined the School of Generalism, and I applied to the school because I saw an advert and it said that this course and this programme aims to provide all NHS staff with common concepts and language to help improve patient care. And to be honest, I thought that sounds like a bit of me. It was a 12-month programme, and it involved some face-to-face learning and some self-directed learning, and also some really excellent professional supervision with a range of different professionals from different therapy backgrounds, nursing, medics, business, administrative, tech people. It was fantastic. It was a real opportunity to walk in the shoes of other people that kind of contribute to that bigger NHS picture. And the course focused on developing this core set of skills and concepts that can work across all roles, regardless of what profession or background you're from, including clinical and non-clinical. And so this interest in professional language was already there. And then I joined the fellowship, and to be honest, it just exploded. And I guess for me, the biggest message I want to share from today is that language has a real psychological power, and the language that we use and the language that we hear really shapes our ideas and our opinions and what we think about ourselves and other people. So, an example of this, the language effect. The best way I can describe to you how powerful language is by describing this macaroni cheese. So, this is not just a macaroni cheese. This is M&S best ever macaroni cheese, because we take free-range egg pasta and we blend it with cave-aged cheddar for richness, pecorino for bite, Emmental for nutty sweetness, and stringy mozzarella for a perfect melted ooze, and then top with roasted garlic, oil, breadcrumbs, crispy onions, and fresh parsley. I can imagine you're all thinking that sounds absolutely great, and for those of you who are having your lunch right now or waiting to have it, probably now ravenous. So the description around that versus macaroni cheese, just essentials. Which one are you going to choose? And which one do you believe is going to be the best? And was it the language and the description that made you have a preference for one or the other? I won't ask you to answer, but I think I probably know the answer to my question. So just a little disclaimer, I'm not an expert in affirming professional language, but I can only talk about what my personal experience has been. And over the last 5 or 6 years, it's something that has become really ingrained in my day-to-day practice. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about my experience and what that's meant for me day-to-day at work. But I just want to mention that some of the language that I'm going to talk about is quite sensitive, and it's not there to shock or disrespect or to upset, but I just want to give you some examples of the types of things that I used to write and say and report, and how that's changed and developed. And if there's anybody who wants a bit of a debrief afterwards, or feels sort of a bit of personal impact from some of the things we're going to touch on, then please feel free to either ask questions in the chat, or to hang back for a minute or two at the end. So as part of my fellowship, I wanted to focus on how I use professional language when I contribute to autism assessment. So within speech therapy, we complete communication and interaction assessments, and we use some diagnostic criteria tools. So one of those is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. We call it colloquially the DSM-5. And already you can imagine, for someone who's, passionate about the language we use, using an assessment tool that has mental disorders in the title was quite tricky for me to kind of accept and kind of sit comfortably within. The other tool we use is the International Classification of Diseases. You can see where I'm going with this. So for children and young people who are exploring a possible autism diagnosis, to be measured against some criteria that use language such as mental disorder and disease, I think already has this real narrative of it being an incredibly negative thing. In fact, it almost sounds like autism is something that you might be able to catch, which obviously we know isn't true. So the work I was doing and still do was relying on these deficit-driven and outdated and negative descriptors. And the language within these criteria included vocabulary such as abnormal, total lack of, impairment in, failure of, unable to. Um, and the assessment and observation information that I was recording on these children and young people's records and in their kind of lifelong health records was only really capturing difficulties and problems, and there was really very little opportunity to capture any strengths or preferences or anything that was positive or unique or special about them. So I've got some examples that I want to share, and as I've mentioned, these are things that I don't think you would see now, or I hope that you wouldn't from information that's shared by my service. But I just want to give you that sort of real life example of the types of things that we used to write. So when writing about a little person, a child, we used to write things like child has unusual social initiations, the child fails to offer comfort to others, the child does not show pleasure in social interactions, the child has a lack of responsive social smile, little Bobby fails to engage in simple social games, Sophie does not use eye contact appropriately, the child has abnormal volume and pitch. The child has impairment in the use of their facial expression or an inability to coordinate their eye contact and their body language. Uses inappropriate expressions of emotion. I think I'll stop there, but that's just some examples to share with you of the types of things that I was routinely being expected to and did write about the children and young people that I met and supported. And that is a consequence of the system that we report into. So it's because we use these diagnostic criteria, but it didn't feel okay with me, and it didn't feel like inclusive and affirming practice. Other examples that I've got that maybe aren't specific to the diagnostic work that I've done is that when I first moved to work in paediatrics, I picked up a small area of West Cumbria. And, every village, town has got its own anecdotes, its own little tales of things that people will say about it and the people that live there. But in this particular area, I picked up some notes for the children I was going to take onto my caseload. And this was in the paper notes, so pre-electronic patient records. And there were acronyms such as FLK written throughout the notes. And I can remember coming back to the office and being like, FLK, this child's got FLK, what does that mean? And one of my more experienced colleagues who'd worked here a long time said, oh, that stands for funny looking kid. And that was quite typical that people within our sort of wider teams would write descriptive sort of language that was, obviously very inappropriate. I don't want to say fitting for the time because it wasn't, but I don't think at the time they were using it with intention to cause kind of distress or upset, but that was kind of quite accepted within some circles of writing notes. So yeah, FLK was one, that funny looking kid, and I can also remember reading a lot of NFM, which was normal for Mary Port. So they were describing maybe a child's difficulties or developmental level, and then using that type of language to almost sort of justify it. And that didn't feel okay with me. So it raised a lot of questions for me. I thought, how does that make a person feel? And what narrative does the next person now have? So if I write a report about a child or a young person with all of that negative descriptive language, and then the next person picks that up and reads it, what picture am I creating in that person's head? What impression have I gave someone about the child that they're yet to meet or about to meet? From that, a diagnostic feedback report was generated. So you would find out in your feedback, me, my child, my young person, do they meet criteria for autism diagnosis or not? And if so, these are the reasons. And that would stay with the child and the family on their lifelong health records. And that would be the only report or documentation that really explained why they'd met that criteria. So if we're thinking about things like, self discovery and identity, if a child or a young person was wanting to go back and read a report written about themselves when they're perhaps older and wanting to find out more about their neurodivergence, the things they would be reading were just things that I really didn't want to have my name attached to. On the back of that, I was finding that advice and support that was given would tend to focus on trying to encourage a child to become more neurotypical. So, how can you appear to be less autistic? And I was worried that this was portraying to our community that our organisation at NCIC has that ableist viewpoint that we believe that there are, better or preferable neurotypes. And I thought that if we continued to keep using this deficit-focused descriptive language, that we will be failing to champion neurodiversity within our workforce. And there's actually a lot of research to say that, negative words and negative language, when we hear it, they actually activate the amygdala, which is the region of the brain that's responsible for those kind of stress hormones and reactions. So when children or young people are reading or hearing negative language about themselves, it actually has an actual physical impact on them and their stress levels. So, as I've mentioned, it raised really big questions for me. I was worried that we might be being quite complicit in promoting ableism as an organisation. And I was also worried that if I didn't do something about that, that it could impact on a lack of diversity in our future workforce as well. If you were a parent, a carer, child, young person who was reading correspondence from our trust that used language like that and descriptors like that, would you really want to potentially explore a career working for us if that's the way we talk and write about people? And on the back of that, because we do read information shared across services, was I then creating a situation where people were maybe experiencing inequality because of things that I'd written? So people already having either poor expectations or thoughts and opinions about somebody based on what I'd written. So what did I do about it? Well, within our trust, we engage with local initiatives about how we speak about autism. So there was a questionnaire that went out across the county council and the NHS services in Cumbria, and it wanted to capture what people's preferred language and terminology was around neurodivergence. And on the back of the results of that, our team in children's speech and language therapy adopted that preferred language. So we immediately started to use the preferred terminology, preferred descriptors that were identified from people who are neurodivergent themselves. We've fed that through our clinical notes and our documentation, and our reports contain neurodiversity affirming language now. And we are also trying to encourage that modeling of that type of language and those healthy challenges and professional discussions. So, it's not uncommon now if you come into our office that if someone's writing something or if someone says like a comment about a visit they've just been on, that one of us, gently and sensitively and with, the best intentions might say like, oh, did you mean that? Oh, could you think of maybe reframing that? So we are trying to encourage a bit more of that healthy challenge. And it's not, like I say, it's not to cause anyone any upset or concern. It's just to try and support each other to develop the language and the narrative that we're using when we talk about the people that we work with and support. Obviously, involved in that has been lots of continuous reflection. It's not something that's just easy to get right the first time. I think it's something that will be developing for as long as I am working. And there are things that I wrote a year ago thinking I was doing a good job that I now read back and think, oh boy, why did I write that? But then that is a sign of growth and development in itself. It isn't always easy to be affirming, like as I've mentioned there, like revisiting language we've previously used. There's things I've read that I recorded in children's notes, 5-10 years ago, and I think, but rather than be frustrated and annoyed at myself, I think to myself, well, I know better now, and I wouldn't write it that way now. We are really trying to commit to using that descriptive language rather than language that has judgment attached to it. We're trying to avoid comments that describe things as normal or abnormal, even things as like normal eye contact. Well, what does that look like? And even if someone has a preference for less eye contact, well, what does that actually mean? If that's just them and that's their preference, who am I to say what is normal or abnormal? And also what's normal or abnormal for me? It might be very different to Richard or, trying to kind of take away some of that judgment and personal opinion. And then also describing patterns of behaviour based on what you think the function might be. So, you'd often read in clinical notes, both before working with children, but when I worked in the acute and I was on wards or elderly care, things like that, I'd see, Edna had a meltdown or Edna was lashing out. But actually, is that what you mean, or do you mean that the behaviour is communicating their distress? I think like lashing out and having a meltdown feel like they're almost, choices that you might make rather than because you're experiencing distress or you're experiencing discomfort or pain. Often I still read now lots about challenging behaviour, but what does that actually mean? And who is the behaviour challenging for? So an example of that would, it's my idea of challenging behaviour is shaped and explained by what my set of life and professional experience has been, just as yours will in the roles that you work in. If you read something like Edna is demonstrating challenging behaviour, that could mean someone who's loudly, verbally opting out of a meal at lunchtime, or it could mean someone who's, biting the lower arms of a physiotherapist who's trying to help them mobilise. It could mean such a variety of things. And it leaves it quite open to interpretation. So, yeah, I think being mindful of, what am I actually writing what I mean? So, what that meant for me was moving from that deficit driven language, that ableist language, to more affirming and reframed language. So, where I might have said previously, oh, this child has shown restricted play or has odd interests or unusual obsessions, I would now say, specialized or focused or intense interests. I might have said they don't use appropriate nonverbal communication, whereas now I would use language like there can be a mismatch between their nonverbal communication and the situation. I'd have probably said they had sensory needs. Now I very much commit to saying things like sensory preferences, or they have a preference for this type of sensory input, or these are their sensory motivators. I would have said things like they are fixated on whatever, whereas reframing that to they now have a long-standing interest in whatever topic, Star Wars, butterflies, Bake Off, whatever. The child is non-verbal. Well, we've definitely moved away from that one because although it was meant to be a description of someone being non-speaking, reading that someone's non-verbal, I think also gives out an idea that they may have difficulty with comprehension, understanding, processing, which isn't necessarily true. So again, taking that to being something descriptive, so rather than non-verbal, we would say non-speaking. Very routine bound, would say has a preference for routines. And poor eye contact, we would say have a preference for less eye contact. So there's still a long way to go. In our team, we're currently focusing on trying to have more collaborative goal setting that focuses on not just what we think a good outcome would be, but very much what the child or young person's voice and preference expresses and communicates. We're trying to learn from experience, so lots of seeking feedback and reflection, asking children and their families about, what was your experience like reading that about yourself that we wrote or that we put together or that we shared. Definitely thinking about our language around safeguarding. So, for example, we often see in notes things like mother continues to make poor relationship choices, but do we actually mean that, mum has found it difficult to navigate through positive relationships with men, or what is it we're actually trying to describe? We would read things like parents prioritize feeding their drug habit over caring for the children. Do we mean that parents are finding it challenging to prioritize their children's needs while they're having high support needs with their own addiction or with their alcohol use? You can reframe it to give the same message but without that judgment. I think part of this as well also includes considering the language we use to describe our services or commenting on each other. Reading things in the notes like occupational therapist rejected the request for support. I think it gives the impression that somebody in OT was sat there saying, I will reject this referral, when maybe what we mean is, occupational therapy redirected this referral as they didn't feel best placed to give that support. Or speech and language therapist has offered limited support to parents. We don't know that that's true, so we have to be careful about the language we use to describe other services as well. And it's okay to check. So it's fine to check with people and their families, like, how would you like me to record this? Or what would you like me to put in the notes about what you've told me today? So what can you do today? Well, could we think about including professional language in our professional supervision? Do we share examples of affirming language with each other? Do we have those conversations in the office, on the ward, in the department? Like, oh, I wonder if you could maybe capture it this way. I wonder if you could maybe share that information like this. Are we thinking about language when we audit our notes and our reports? Can we learn from each other? So can we have that across profession supervision and ask how you might capture that in your survey? So how do you write about children, adults, young people, elderly in your team? And who's within our sphere of influence? So when we're thinking about modeling the language back that we'd like to receive, who can we kind of feed that out to? So thinking about students, colleagues, people who are on rotation. Can we do a self-check? So ask yourself, like, would I be okay reading this about myself? And it is time consuming when you're writing notes or records or reports, but it is very meaningful and very powerful. And, ask yourself, am I actually saying what I mean? When I write this, is this actually what I mean about this person? Yeah, and just to end on this, so I think it's a great opportunity when thinking about language that you can be the reason why someone feels included, welcomed, supported, safe, and valued. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Lorna. That was very interesting, actually. And it was, yeah, sort of very much something of two halves, actually, because I was actually quite sort of shocked that that sort of language was still being used even now. But it sounds like you've gone on a really positive journey to fix that. So that's excellent. So I'm just wondering, has anybody got any questions for Lorna at the moment? I know you said you're happy to take questions
Yeah,
outside this
definitely.
session, and we will share the slides as well. So if you would like to follow up with Lorna, feel free. But have we got any questions at the moment? Oh, Sam's got his hand up. Sam?
Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Lorna, hello.
Hi, Sam.
It's a great pleasure to hear you talk about this. We know each other already, and it's a matter of pride to hear you talk about what you're doing generally, and also how you've done that through being a learner through the School of Generalism. That's not the first time I've heard you talk about it, but it's really wonderful. The other thing I'd like to just offer is that on the call, you're joined by Dr. Roger Cable, who's now the clinical lead for mental health and learning disability for NCIC. And it might be worth arranging a discussion with Roger, who's just waved at you, to just understand what you're doing within the service. Roger needs to understand where all things mental health and learning disability are happening. And the map doesn't include what you do just at the moment.
That sounds good.
Wonderful.
Great.
Thanks
Thank
so
you,
much,
Sam.
Lorna.
And then Mark Humble. Mark.
Hi, Lorna. I'm just fascinated by all this. I think it's really, really important stuff, that cultural shift that we need to make around language. And I could talk to you all day about it. But one of the things I'm really keen to, I suppose, share and understand from you is that use of acronyms that we've seen across the system, particularly when we talk about people. It's interesting. You mentioned learning disability, mental health, and autism. How many times you hear LD, how many times you hear MHLD, how many times you hear CYP. It's just really, really depersonalizing language. We're talking about groups of people who, struggle to be seen as human sometimes. And yet we use this language willy-nilly that effectively depersonalizes people. And so there's something about acronyms, and I think that use of language, very often we hear about we're looking for a placement for someone. But if you use a term like we're looking for a home for someone, it just means so much more when you're thinking about a home rather than the placement. And don't get me on the words like special. Special just means you're different. It doesn't mean the same as we mean when we're special. We call something special, it means different.
Yeah, I think that's thank you for sharing that, because I think unfortunately a lot of this is just that's the way we were taught. So we have been brought through quite a medical model, even of those of us that work in maybe therapeutic backgrounds. And it's not, it's not like somebody's been doing this on purpose to cause concern or distress, but we have been taught to describe problems. And even within our own children's teams, when children are having assessments, they will start a clinic letter with problems, and there'll be a whole list. So if your list of problems says like has a learning disability, or even has a diagnosis of Down syndrome, or has a genetic profile of whatever, if they're already pre-labeled with the word problem, and you're a child, an adult, a parent, a young person reading that about yourself, then your identity, the things that make you unique and the things that make you you, medical or not, are listed as problems, and that creates a narrative right from the beginning. So yeah, the way you're right, we need to think about what does that actually mean for someone. So like you said about placement and home, if you're actually describing, I want to find somewhere suitable for this person, feel safe and supported well and can reach the potential, that's far more meaningful, isn't it, than writing something like a placement. Yeah, and I too could wait on about this all day, so it's just as well that it's only a short session, otherwise you'll be here till 10 p.m. Yeah.
No, thanks, Lorna. Yes, and we are up to the half-hour mark now. So if we haven't got any further questions, Lorna will happily take anything outside of this, as we say. So yes, so I'd just like to advertise our next session, which is on the 14th of January at 1 o'clock, and that's Dr. Clarissa Giebel will be talking about co-producing a board game to educate about dementia inequalities. Just a reminder that there's the survey in the chat as well, if you wouldn't mind filling that in and just giving us a quick bit of feedback, that would be very much appreciated. And then just finally, thank you again, Lorna. That was
Okay.
very interesting, very insightful, and very useful. So thank you for doing that for us today.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you all for coming. So goodbye.